Hello and welcome to today's webinar for mental health professionals, Socratic dialogue and collaborative empiricism, practical strategies to overcome common pitfalls, featuring Dr. Scott Waltman.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. So today we're doing a webinar. This is based on, actually it was going to be a workshop at ADAA in March 2020, but that got postponed because of the COVID situation. So I'm excited that we're able to do this webinar here. I'm going to be talking about Socratic dialogue and collaborative empiricism, covering some practical strategies to overcome common pitfalls that come up. We have some learning objectives if you're trying to figure out what are you in for. So we have a four-step framework for Socratic dialogue. And the goal is to help cover micro and macro skills that go with the framework. So we want people to be able to attend this and then walk away with some practical things that you can apply to your sessions. It's important that I highlight that I do have a financial disclosure. We have a book that just came out. I do receive royalties for that. The content from the slides is based on what's in the book. And I put the book here because I just love the cover so much. It's so pretty. But just so you know, I do have a financial interest in the topic. So I want to do a brief literature review. My guess is that people are more interested in the clinically applied stuff than the literature stuff, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time getting into the literature. But I do want to cover some key points that are important to know. So guided discovery, Socratic questioning, collaborative empiricism, these are parallel terms that they're overlapping, not exactly the same, but they're all fairly similar. The basic idea is that there's an emphasis placed in the cognitive and behavioral therapies on joining with the client collaboratively and then helping them apply scientific curiosity to their thought and behavior patterns. So we're trying to teach people to come to new conclusions on their own instead of giving them the answer. So it's a guided discovery or a collaborative empiricism. Socratic questioning or Socratic dialogue would be a type of guided discovery or collaborative empiricism. As you can see from a theoretical perspective, it's thought that this Socratic process of guided discovery leads to a deeper level of learning and change. We don't actually know that, though. No one's actually studied it. There actually hasn't been a ton of research done on Socratic questioning or Socratic processes, especially within the field of psychotherapy. One study that was done by Braun et al., they looked at previous treatment of CBT for depression, and they coded the sessions to see how much Socratic questioning is being used and how does that influence treatment outcomes. And what they found were that sessions where there was more Socratic questioning used, the client was more likely to have a decrease in depressive symptoms at the following session. And then they found that this finding held true even after controlling for other variables like relationships. So it's not just that, it's not just the relationship. It's not just that clients like us if we do Socratic questioning, but there's something else to it. But we definitely need more research on this. If people are interested in doing this, at the very end of the slides, there's my email. I'm happy to connect you with two recent measures that came out recently, the Socratic Dialogue Grading Scale and the Socratic Dialogue Grading Matrix. They're similar but different, and certainly I think both people who made the measures are certainly interested in getting some research done on the topic. But let's talk a little bit about kind of where does the content from today come from and what is this based on? So I'm a CBT trainer for the Academy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapies, and I previously was a trainer for one of Aaron Beck's teams at Penn, the Beck Community Initiative. So both of these are partnerships between CBT organizations and public mental health systems. So there's a big training going on in Los Angeles County, where we're training clinicians in the public mental health system to do CBT at the quality you'd see in a clinical trial. We're currently on cohort 37. We've trained thousands of people in it. It's been going for a few years. It's been quite successful and it's exciting. And then there's other programs in the city of Philadelphia where they're training clinicians who work in the community behavioral health system there as well. So there's similar programs, but they're different. And what the trainers were talking, and we were saying, hey, it seems like we're kind of typing it and we're giving people the same feedback over and over again. Is there a way that we can anticipate the common problems that people are going to have and address those preemptively? Can we change the way we're teaching to address the problems people are having? And being a bunch of cognitive therapists, we said, oh, we can kind of study this. You know, we could form some hypotheses. We can check the evidence. So we did a research study where we interviewed the trainers, but we wanted to look at 2 different programs because we didn't want the findings to just be program specific. Because if it was just one program, it might just be there's a problem with the curriculum. So we interviewed the trainers and we asked them, what are the common problems that you see people having? How do they tend to get better? And the questions were wrapped around the cognitive therapy rating scale, which is the most common treatment fidelity measure in CBT. So here's the link for the article. You can read the whole thing there, or you could email me. I'll get you connected with it as well. I'm not going to go through all of the findings because I want to spend time prioritizing talking about Socratic questioning. But if you look down here on the left, there's 11 items. These are the 11 items to CTRS. This item in the middle, guided discovery, that's a different color. This is where Socratic questioning would load. So you can see 100% of trainers said, yes, I commonly see a problem here. People have problems doing this. And then we asked, well, okay, you're providing 4 to 6 months of clinical case consultation. Do they get better? And by and large, they said, yeah, people improve, but most people only sort of improve. And so people have problems with it, they get better, but they don't get as better as we'd want them to be. And so that made us think, well, maybe we got to think about how we're teaching this, and can we reformulate it to get better outcomes? So here's some of the common difficulties that we see, which then in turn influence the model that we developed. So one of the common difficulties we found was this idea of provided discovery. Provided discovery would be kind of the opposite of guided discovery. So guided discovery, we're joining with the client, we're collaboratively working, we're trying to discover what is true, what is real, what is helpful together. Provided discovery is more saying, look, here's the way you should be looking at this. It's providing reframes, providing interpretations, giving advice, giving answers. And it's not that that's not helpful, because certainly we have a lot of wisdom. The trouble that we find kind of anecdotally, again, we haven't studied this from a research perspective, we'd love to get someone to study it, but anecdotally what you might find is sometimes in sessions, you say things that are completely brilliant, your client misses it totally. Or you say something completely brilliant and your client says, oh, that's brilliant, I like that. And then next week it's like you never said it. So you're kind of saying it over and over and over again. And so it's not as meaningful to them if they get it too easily. So the goal of guided discovery is we want to help people really discover it, because then they'll really pay attention to it. It'll mean more to them. So provided discovery is a common problem that we see. A similar thing that was found was a lot of people fall into the pitfall of advice giving. And these training programs are training folks who are both early career professionals and people who've been in the field for decades. And what they found was that the more seasoned professionals were really apt to fall into this role of the sage who gives advice and tells people, here's what you should do, here's what you should think. And again, it's not bad advice. It's just not compatible with the idea of guided discovery. And finally, a third thing that they found was that, I'll just read this because it's kind of long and you might be reading it and not listening to me. So it says, this is one of the hardest skills. So naturally, trainees struggle with it. They seem to do okay when it's in the context of a specific intervention, for example, 3 C's, which I'll talk about, but they do less well when having to adopt the skill of taking a stance of guided discovery throughout the session. So the 3 C's is a simplified way to do Socratic questioning, or really kind of cognitive modification. So it was developed to be used with older adults who had some cognitive limitations. So catch it, check it, change it. And then it's also been used with like children and such. It's not the model that I'm advocating here. It is a CBT skill. It exists out there. Some people like it. We're approaching more of kind of a deeper, more of a dialogue than something that's more of a kind of a 3-step kind of question. But the idea here is that clinicians could learn, or it was easier for them to learn techniques and harder for them to understand kind of the mental process and thinking through it and trying to understand what are we trying to accomplish. So we had to think about, well, what are the principles we're trying to teach, and can we teach people these principles, not just the techniques. So we looked to reformulate the way we were teaching it. So there's currently, there's maybe a few more models out there, but there's 2 major models in the field of CBT. So Podesky has a model that she came out with in 1993. It's a really good model. This model is based on a talk that she gave at one of the European CBT associations. She was a keynote address. and it's freely available on her website. You should read her talk. If you haven't read it, it's really good. If you have read it, you should read it again because it's just really good. So her model is, first we're going to ask informal questions, and as we ask informal questions, we're going to listen to what the person's telling us. So it's not just questions, but it's a dialogue. And then we're going to summarize what we're hearing, and we're going to ask synthesizing and analytical questions about the summary that we come up with. So it's a useful guide. As we were talking with the trainers, we found that the clinicians we were training had trouble applying this. So we did a second qualitative study that I don't have time to get into. It is in chapter 4 of the book, where we interviewed the trainers to see, well, how do you apply this in practice? What does it look like? Trying to understand from an inductive perspective, what does the process of applying this look like? And so what we found was that the way people approach this was slightly different than the way that it's organized. And so we looked to reorganize and reconceptualize how we teach this process to help people better understand how to do it. So the idea would be, if you heard one clinician doing this revised model or one clinician doing the original model, there wouldn't be a lot of difference if they were doing both models well. It might sound pretty similar, but the difference is how it's organized, how it's taught, with the hope that it'll help address some of the stuck points that we saw. So our revised model, which is what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about today. Step 1 is focusing. So the first thing that we found in the stuck points study was that people often didn't know what to ask questions about. So many clients have really negative thoughts, and a lot of them have really negative thoughts a lot of the time, right? If you're an OCD therapist, you might be telling your client, look, you have 10 to 15,000 thoughts in a day, right? We can't focus on all of them. If you're in session with your client and they have a lot of negative thoughts coming up, we can't focus on all of them. But novice therapists often will kind of go after every negative thought that they see, and then they get kind of caught with stuff that's shiny, caught with stuff that's a distraction, caught with stuff that's not central. So they end up really focusing and hammering on something that isn't really central to the conceptualization, the presenting problem. There's not a lot of meat to work with, and it ends up kind of falling flat. So our first step is to try to figure out, well, what are we going to focus on? What are we aiming this at? And after we figure out what we're aiming it at, we're going to try and come to understand it from the client's point of view. So this is the opposite of provided discovery. So provided discovery is you saying, look, I have the answer. Let me show you the answer I have. I'm the keeper of wisdom. So to target that, we said, well, we're going to focus on first trying to see it from their point of view. We're going to see, how does this perfectly make sense? And once we see it from their point of view, collaborative curiosity, we're going to try and expand that point of view together. So now I'm here with you. I'm trying to see what might we be missing. What have we not talked about yet? And then finally, we'll have a summary and a synthesis where we'll pull it all together. So that's the model that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to try to say that the bulk of our time covering that. We had wanted to do more of like a role play, though, that ended up not working out as well in the current format. So instead, I have a case example that I'm going to use. So Fiona, as you can see, not her real name. Fiona is a 34-year-old African-American, heterosexual, cisgender married woman. She has a history of growing up in an emotionally invalidating environment where emotionality was shamed and achievement was emphasized. So we want you to do good. We want you to accomplish stuff. We don't want you to have feelings. If you have feelings, that's bad. Something's wrong with that. So normal human emotions that we all have were taught as like a dirty secret. And so they felt dangerous, they were confusing, they were shameful. And you might imagine what happens to someone who has feelings but is told it's not okay to have feelings. You kind of get more feelings, and you have to keep kind of hiding them. So she achieved a lot in relation to academics and sports, right? She was quite accomplished. She did well academically. She was an all-star athlete in 2 different sports, actually, which is pretty amazing. And despite all that, she felt like something was wrong with her. And she developed the belief that she wasn't good enough and she was defective. And these feelings were very shameful to her, which only compounded her feelings of depression. So she had feelings and she felt it wasn't okay to have feelings, so she thought there was something wrong with her. And because she thought there was something wrong with her, she had more feelings. And because she had more feelings, she thought there really was something wrong with her. And it became a vicious cycle of her having feelings and trying to not have feelings and thinking there's something wrong with her, and really suffering in silence and trying to keep up this image that I'm totally fine, nothing's wrong. So over time, she developed a compensatory strategy. She was quite creative. So she said, well, if there's something wrong with me, I'll just be someone else. And so she was constantly trying to figure out who in my life do I think is a better person, and I'll try and be that person. And so as she's constantly reinventing herself, thinking that she's chasing this idea of being good enough, it was never fulfilling because there's an unintended consequence, right? If you're always trying to be someone else, you're never getting to know yourself. You're never learning to love yourself, to trust yourself, to be in contact with your emotions. Also, your relationships tend to be pretty shallow, right? You might be charming if you're faking it, but you can't form a real relationship with something that's not real. So she has people in her life, but no one that she feels really close with, and she doesn't really know herself, and it feels very empty, and it shouldn't feel empty because it should be working, and she feels terrible. So there's a lot of cognitions that we want to target, right? So there's this idea that there's something wrong with me, and I'm the only one who feels this way. Further, there's some thoughts, if my family knew how I was feeling, they would reject me. And if people got to know the real me, they wouldn't like me. So let's see how we might apply this framework to work with someone like Fiona. So the first step of the framework is focusing. Right? Remember, there's a lot going on, right? Fiona has a long, complicated history, and we could really get lost in kind of stories for the rest of treatment, but it'd be hard to really get some predictable movement if we're just kind of lost in everything. So we want to try and focus in on typical situations that are difficult for her, so we can try and focus in on what's the underlying belief, so we can try and get some movement on the strategic elements of the conceptualization. So the skill of focusing is, first we're trying to break these situations down to figure out which parts of the situation are we going to focus on. And as we break the situation down, we're going to try and do like a differential diagnosis of thought, right? So all these different thoughts that are going on here, which thought exactly are we working on? And then from there, we're going to create a shared definition, which we'll talk about as well. So here are a number of questions you can ask yourself. I'm not necessarily going to read through all of these because I feel like people, if you're watching this, you can probably hit pause and read it. Also, the slides will be available. If you email the ADAA webinars folks, they'll send it to you, or my email's at the end. You can always just email me and I'll send it to you as well. But there's a number of questions you can ask yourself, right? So we can say, here's this upsetting thing that happened. How does this fit? What are all the different pieces of this? So to make this less abstract, so Fiona had all these ideas that there was something wrong with her. She had this exhaustion from pretending nothing was wrong with her. And she was always trying to do everything for everyone because she was trying to overcompensate for thinking she wasn't good enough. So meeting with her, of course, she's exhausted, demoralized, and we're trying to figure out, well, was there a time this week you were particularly depressed? And she says, yes. I got home from work on Thursday, and the house was a mess. Food wasn't made. Kids were home for school. They needed help with their homework. They wanted to spend time with me. I was tired. I was a mess. My clothes weren't even clean. And I just wanted to hide. I didn't want to do anything, and I just felt terrible. So there's a lot of pieces there, right? And of course, there's a chance for us to provide empathy, provide validation, be with her in her emotions. And as we're moving to a change strategy, right, we want to try and zero in on what exactly are we focusing on here. So what are the different components of the story, right? So there's this part where she gets home from work and the exhaustion of being at work and masking. She gets home and the house is a mess and she feels bad because what kind of mom would do this? What kind of wife would do this? The kids need food and she doesn't have like food already made because she was at work, and she doesn't have the energy to make anything because she's chronically depressed and masking her depression. And then she has all these self-judgments about her appearance and so on and so forth. And then there's this piece about just not wanting to be there, not wanting to be around them, wishing her kids would go away. So as we're kind of mapping it out, there's a chance for us to highlight, look, there's all these different pieces. No wonder you're so tired. And what's the most upsetting part? And if we're focusing in on this situation, there's kind of two things that we could really focus in on. So if there was some impulsive behavior that we're trying to target, we can look and see, well, what was the thing that happened right before that? Is there some kind of trigger event that happened that we want to really focus on? And if there wasn't a clear impulsive behavior, then we're looking to see, well, what was the most upsetting part? What's the worst part? So in asking Fiona, what's the worst part? She would say, well, the worst part is I was so tired, but I just didn't want to be around my kids. They were so excited to see me, and I was so unhappy to see them. okay, so that's what we want to focus on, right? So how do you feel about that? Well, I feel bad. I feel ashamed. I feel like I'm terrible. Uh, right. Then we're looking to see, what are the different thoughts of the situation, right? So how are you making sense of that? What did that mean to you? Right. This idea that your kids were excited to see you and you weren't excited to see them. What do you tell yourself about that? Right. So thoughts like, I must be a bad mother. I can't believe I don't love them. I'm as bad as my own mother was. What's wrong with me? I can't do anything right. And then we're asking ourselves, well, am I missing anything? Is there something, is there a piece of the story that we're not hearing? And that's just a useful question, because a lot of times our clients are just kind of constantly thinking about stuff. And so they'll tell us parts of the story, but not the whole story, just because they're just always talking about it. So they're not aware what they've told us and not told us. So if there's a part that doesn't make sense, we can say, well, this part doesn't really make sense. So you got home, all this stuff needs to be done. You feel terrible. The kids need all this stuff. Um, what? So I know you're married, and I know your husband's actually out of work right now. So where's he during all this? Oh, he's watching TV. He's watching Sports Center. He's actually kind of mad that there's not any food ready. That's really good context for understand, right? If she feels bad for not doing everything, and there's someone who seems to not be doing enough, it's good context. So we're trying to figure out what's going on here. And then we're trying to see how is what we're hearing fitting with our what we would expect to be hearing, because oftentimes we're trying to revise our conceptualization as we're learning new information. We're trying to refine our views of the client. We're keeping an ear out for cognitive distortions and our irrational beliefs, though the difference between like a truly Socratic process and like a distortion focused challenging is a person who's focused on distortions is going to be challenging when they hear it. They're going to say, well, that sounds like all or nothing thinking. That sounds like black or white thinking. That sounds like you're catastrophizing. And we're not trying to discount it from the outset, because we don't actually know if it's true or not. Further, it's anti-collaboration to discount something before really looking at it together with them. So if it's distorted, it'll come out in the evaluation. We don't need to harp on them or call them out as mental sinners for having distortions. So we're just trying to figure out, what are we trying to target here? And we have a form that you can use to help with this. So this form is the focusing worksheet. It's in the book, or it's right here. You can just use this slide. So it's just a way to help break down the situation and organize what's going on. It helps the client understand, oh, here's what's going on. Because for them, there's all the emotion tied in it. It's hard for them to think clearly about it. So situation description. I come home from work. House is a mess. I'm a mess. There's no food. Kids want to see me. I don't want to see them. And then I say, and your husband's on the couch watching Sports Center. And my husband's on the couch watching Sports Center. All right, write it on down. So what are the different upsetting things that happen? Let's write out all the different parts. And then we're going to say, well, what's the most upsetting part? For her, the most upsetting part is my kids want to spend time with me. I don't want to spend time with them. And then what thoughts are going through your mind? I just wish they'd leave me alone. Oh, what's wrong with me? Why don't I want to spend time with them? I'm a terrible mother. And then we're looking to see, what feelings, do the feelings and thoughts line up? And part of the reason we're looking to see, do the feelings and thoughts line up, is sometimes there are thoughts that aren't articulated or feelings they're not aware of. And as we're trying to line up, well, which thought goes with which feeling, we might find something that's important to work with, especially for someone who's really socialized to gender roles around anger or sadness or things like that, right? So I have plenty of clients who feel like anger is the only okay emotion for a man to have. And they'll tell me thoughts that sound really sad, but they're saying they feel angry. And I have to highlight for them, well, if I had this thought, I'd be feeling really sad. Were you feeling sad? Maybe just like a little bit of sadness. Okay, so a little bit of sadness. Let's write that down. So we're trying to see, how does it line up? And from here, we're trying to see, well, which thought is most upsetting? Oftentimes, though, as a side note, if the anger is kind of secondary to the hurt, we're going to go for the hurt. If the anger is a way to avoid feeling bad, we're going to go for the vulnerability. So which thought was most upsetting? For her, the most upsetting thought was, I'm a bad mom. I don't want to be around my kids. They want to be around me. What's wrong with me? So then we want to say, what's the emotional meaning of this thought? And the way we can do that is using something like the downward arrow. So we could say, so if that was true that you were a bad mom, what would that mean about you? I mean, I'm broken. That would mean I'm going to hurt my kids the way that my mom hurt me. Okay, so if that was true, that you were going to hurt your kids the way your mom hurt you, what would that mean about you? That would mean that there really is something wrong with me. I've always been afraid something was wrong with me, and that would mean I'm I'm just different from other people, and I'm not fit to have relationships. Okay, so if that was true, what would that mean? That would mean I'm broken. So we kind of go down till you hit a loop, or if you do it enough, you learn to listen for kind of a change in the way that they speak. Usually there's kind of a drop in voice when people hit that kind of underlying meaning where they go like, oh, I guess that means I was broken. It's kind of a, as they make contact with the emotion of it, you'll hear it if you listen for it. So we find what we want to focus on, right? This idea of I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, I'm not a good mother. And so we want to evaluate that. Though what you might be wondering is, well, who really is a good mother? How are we defining this? So there's a strategy, which I stole from James Overholser. It's such a good strategy. I love it. The idea is creating a shared definition. And this is something that actually is similar to what Socrates would do, right? So Socrates, his Socratic question was focused on the idea of ethics. And before having the questioning, they would define, well, what does it mean to be ethical? And then they'd have the questions to see how does this line up with the criteria they set. So if my client has an idea that she's a bad mother, first we got to figure out, well, what does it mean to be a good mother? What does it mean to be a bad mother? This is how we avoid arguing with our clients, because if we don't define it from the outset, they're going to be saying something's evidence that I don't think is evidence, and I'm going to be saying something that I think is evidence that they don't think is evidence, and then we're going to have like a, well, agree to disagree, and it's going to be sort of useless. So we want to create a definition from the outset because it helps us have better collaboration. Right? So questions we might ask, right? In general, so how would we know if someone was a good mother, right? If someone thinks they're a loser, how are we defining being a loser? If someone's afraid they're not a good person, what does it mean to be a good person? So how are we defining this? And the key thing that I really want to highlight is this is not the client's definition, this is a shared definition. This is something we're creating together, this is collaboration. If I ask Fiona, what does it mean to be a bad mother? She's going to immediately tell me everything she thinks she's doing wrong. She's going to say, well, a bad mother would have food for her kids. A bad mother would want to spend time with, wouldn't want to avoid her kids. A bad mother would be having the house all messy. A bad mother wouldn't be so tired. A bad mother would be happy. And you'd go, hold on, Fiona. It sounds like you're kind of beating yourself up in front of me. I think you do that enough when I'm not around. Let's not do that. So not why do you think you're a bad mom? How are we defining this in general? It's a universal definition. And if they're not sure, you can say, well, let's look it up. And the nice thing about living in the digital age, well, one of the few nice things about living in the digital age is we all have small computers we carry around with us everywhere we go, kind of like they're our lungs. So you can say, well, why don't you pull out your phone and why don't you Google, what does it mean to be a good mom? And we'll see what comes up. I'll look it up too. So you might look it up and see what you come up with. Of course, it's good to have a discussion because not everything on the internet is good. But generally, there's a lot of pretty inert or helpful blogs that well-meaning people have made that you can talk about and see what do you think about this. Usually a dictionary definition will come up first. But what you might be noticing is that sounds kind of like a setup, right? Because if someone has these like really, this idealized idea of what's the perfect mom, no one's going to fit that, right? I grew up watching Leave It to Beaver, but I know that June Cleaver is not real. So what do we do about that, right? Well, the next thing we want to do is we want to try and set a cutoff. So if that's the definition of a good mom, how often does someone need to do that to be a good mom? Does a good mom have to do this whole list all the time? Do they have to do some of the list all the time, all the stuff some of the time, some of these things most of the time? What's the cutoff? How good is good enough? And usually our clients will say something like, I don't really know. But that's cool. We can work with that, right? If we get some wiggle room, the idea that maybe no one is perfect and maybe there's a place where good is okay or being good enough is okay, that's gravy. I can work from there. But it's useful to try and kind of highlight, like, what do you think the cutoff is? Like, where do you think is the benchmark for being good enough? What are the things that you think a mom has to do in order to be good enough? Well, I guess she's got to, make sure her kids are protected, make sure they have food. So you didn't make dinner, but your kids weren't starving, which is kind of a conversation we're going to get into later. But how are we defining this? And sometimes it's helpful to kind of make a continuum, right? So what if we were to define the ideal mother and the absolute worst mother? And then kind of look at all the places in between. Because there's a lot of things my client isn't doing that she's not giving herself credit for not doing, right? She's not pimping her kids out. She's not beating her kids. There's a lot of things that are really terrible that she's not doing. And it's important to highlight, if she feels like she's the absolute worst, it's important to help her understand you're definitely not the absolute worst. You're really depressed, and we can work on that. So if we can kind of map it out, I might do A, B, C, D, F. If I have someone who was kind of acculturated into like an educational system, if I have someone who has a history of maybe not doing great in school, I might not focus on that because they might kind of see themselves as an F person. But if we can kind of draw it out, where do you fall? And later on that continuum, we can talk about, well, just because you're here now doesn't mean you always have to be here, and where have you been in the past and such. So once we have that, then we want to move into phenomenological understanding, right? So we have this idea, we've defined kind of what we think a good enough mom is. And we're trying to look at, well, how does it make sense that you came to believe that you're not good enough? How does it make sense that you came to believe you're the only one who feels this way? How does it make sense that you came to think feelings are bad and no one has feelings, you're the only one? And with what I was telling you about Fiona already, you might already have some ideas. And it's useful to know that we're trying to see it from their point of view. That's the whole goal. The whole goal is perspective taking. Phenomenological is a philosophical or a humanistic psychology term. It refers to understanding something in both subjective and objective terms. Sometimes, like, cognitive therapists really want to focus on just the facts, like Dragnet. Just give me the evidence that this is true. I don't want to hear the evidence, anything that's not evidence. And the trouble with that is a lot of the reasons people believe stuff is not exactly evidence. And we have to at least listen to it, right? We have to honor it. Otherwise, our clients come up with this dualism where they'll say things like, well, factually, I know this isn't true, but I just really feel this way. And so we can't ignore the things that aren't strictly evidence, but as emotional evidence to the person. We're trying to get a sense of what's it like to believe this? What does this cause you to do? How does this influence your life? How is this self-sustaining? And this is also a place to fold in some validation, right? To pull from like the dialectical behavior therapy and stuff like that, and to know that validation often provides regulation for emotions. To know that as we're talking about something that might be upsetting, we can provide some validation, which will help soothe the client, also be good for rapport, decrease defensiveness. And if we can make this a practice in validation, then it's going to be a lot easier to help them see the other side as well. Things that might be less in line with what they were previously seeing. So there's a lot of questions that we can teach people to ask themselves, and we can be asking ourselves while we're going through the process, right? So we're trying to figure out what experiences are this thought based on, right? So if we take Fiona's idea that I'm the only one who feels this way, I'm the only one with these negative feelings, what experiences are these based on? Well, growing up, she was in a family where it wasn't okay to have feelings, and this was explicitly told to her, right? So what happened when you were young? What happened when you cried? Well, my dad would sit me down and he would tell me to cut it out, and he would send me to my room. He would tell me that no one wants to see this and that I should hide this and I shouldn't do it. Okay, so you were punished for crying. Okay, it's good information for me to know. In fact, really telling information was, I think like my third session with Fiona when she confessed to me that she had depression. It was terrifying to her, this idea of saying out loud, I'm not happy. In fact, I feel quite unhappy. It's really informative about, this is a real dark secret for you. From where you're coming from, it's like you're telling me you murdered someone. So what are the facts that support this, right? Well, the facts are, when she was growing up, a person of authority told her this. What are other facts that went along with this? Well, she has two siblings and they seem to follow the rules growing up. She never saw them be emotional. Are there other facts that support this? Well, we know she has a lot of superficial relationships. So she knows people, but not on an intimate level. So she doesn't know that other people have feelings because she doesn't know them well enough to talk about their feelings or her feelings, right? She has this kind of Instagram level friendship with people. All right, and we're trying to ask ourselves, well, if this was true, right? If it was true that she was the only person who had emotions, how would we know? What would that look like? Is this something people have said to them? What's it like to believe this? If we can understand what it's like to believe this, then we can understand how it's affecting what they do, what they pay attention to, how they filter information, and then we can understand what are they missing? How long have they believed this? What do they tend to do this when they believe this more or less? It's also, again, like I said before, this is a chance to provide some validation. So yeah, I see how you got here, right? When we're talking about the way you grew up and these explicit things your father told you and did when you were emotional, I totally understand how you were trained to not have emotions. The trouble was you were still human and you still had them, so you learned it was really bad to have them. It was kind of this deep dark secret that you couldn't excise them from you. So we're trying to understand the context of it, because if we understand the context of it, then we understand kind of what's the evidence that we have to draw from. How does this make perfect sense? So the idea is that when people have a belief, right, there's something wrong with me, I'm the only one who feels this way, that belief is going to affect their predictions of what happens in any given situation. They're going to think, well, if I tell my husband, if I tell my colleagues, if I tell my friends or my family that I'm depressed, they're going to reject me. They're going to think I'm a screw up. They're going to tell me that they don't want to hear it. They're going to send me away. And so what's the behavior? I'm going to mask. I'm going to pretend like everything's fine. I'm going to suffer in silence. And I'm going to be afraid to even cry by myself because I can't admit it to myself. And what the outcome is I don't learn that other people have feelings too. And I'm completely exhausted from holding them in all the time. And then people filter stuff in keeping with their expectations, right? There's a confirmation bias. So if she has to say that she's the only one, she spends all this time on Instagram looking at other people's pages, looking at how perfect their lives are, and she's comparing their absolute best moments to her absolute worst moments, right? They're filtered, engineered pictures with the messiness of real life. And she's saying, I am a total screw up. What is wrong with me? So as we see this, we're going, oh, I see how you got here. But we're not pushing in too fast to say, well, obviously you're wrong. Obviously you're missing this, because we need to honor the emotion of it. We can't bring about true schematic change without activating the emotions that go with the belief. So we're trying to access the emotions. We're being very emotional validating. And we're just trying to understand it. We're really trying to say, help me understand how you got here. Help me understand how this makes sense. And we're trying to store away this information because we're going to try and expand this together. It's useful with clients if you can try and kind of map out for them of, what's this assumption that you have? How does this affect the predictions you make? How does this affect what you do? How does this affect what you get? And then how are you paying attention to that in a way that's then keeping the cycle going? So there's a lot of things that we want to try and understand if we're trying to have a good understanding of the basis of the belief. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we're trying to understand, well, what led to you thinking this way? What's the current evidence that supports this? Are there any current filterings that's going on? Are you discounting positives? Are you discounting things that might not fit with this? Are you twisting stuff? Are you twisting successes into failures? Right, when you're doing exposure therapy and the client's like, well, I did it, but I got afraid, so obviously I didn't do it right. And you're saying, no, I actually needed you to get afraid, and that's how this works. Good job. And I'm like, what? So we're trying to figure out, are there filters at play? What's the emotional meaning of all these different factors? And how does this affect what they do? And how does that in turn shape their environment? So once we have an understanding where they're coming from, then we can say, so I think I'm understanding how you got here. There's a chance for us to restate for them, here's what you're telling me, and for us to check our understanding. And if understanding isn't quite there, we can work with them to try to increase our understanding. Clients often find this quite validating, which is going to pay off later. We'll get some kind of money in the relationship bank. So from there, we can move into what we'd call collaborative curiosity. Here's where we're trying to expand that point of view together. We're trying to see what might they be missing, what are they not saying, questions about implications, pervasiveness, permanence, universality, exceptions, double standard, etc. So an example of the implications is, so yes, growing up, your dad did very clearly tell you it's not okay to have feelings, but does that actually mean it's not okay to have feelings, right? If this thing really happened, are the conclusions you're drawing from this valid? Are there other possible conclusions that we could draw from that? So functionally, this is the disconfirming evidence step, right? If you're using a 7-column thought record, like from mind over mood, this would be the column where you're looking at, well, what's the evidence this thought isn't true? From the framework we're talking about, once we've come to see it from their point of view, now we're going to try and expand that point of view together. We're trying to see, what are they missing? My very first clinical supervisor would often say to me, Scott, is this a blind spot or a dumb spot? And I never knew what she meant by it. And I was always embarrassed, and I always thought like she was like insulting me. She might have been. I don't know. I didn't weigh the evidence for it. But the idea is that there's things that we don't see, and there's things that we don't know. So she was trying to say, Scott, is this something that you're missing, or is this something we haven't covered yet? She was just kind of earthy and very pleasant, and I was very fragile. So there's two kinds of blind spots, right? So if when we're trying to expand the point of view, we're trying to see, is this something that they know but they're forgetting because they're really focused on this other point of evidence? Or is it something they don't know because their avoidance has prevented them from engaging in their environment, right? So remember we talked about Fiona's had this idea that she's the only one, and she had this compensatory strategy of reinventing herself and having very superficial relationships. Because of that, if I was to say to Fiona, what's the evidence that other people have feelings too? She would say, I don't know. I've never talked with anyone about that. Okay. So we can't really use just pure question asking to help get people to arrive at evidence that they don't know yet. So we have to go and gather new evidence. So, okay, so if this is a gap in knowledge, let's go and discover some new knowledge together, right? We're joint scientists. Let's check it out. So she has this idea. I love my kids, but I don't know that I do love them because they're so exhausting to me, and I just feel so bad that I want them to go away sometimes. And then she thinks she's the only one who feels this way. So I ask her, so do you think other moms feel this way as well? I mean, no one's posting on Instagram about this, right? So no one on Instagram is posting about this. How much of reality do you think is captured in Instagram? Like if you post on Instagram, are you posting about the stuff you tell me about? Or are you posting about the stuff you tell your family about? Oh, I'm definitely not posting about what I'm telling you. Okay. So do you think that other people are doing the same thing you're doing, or they're doing something different? Maybe they're doing the same thing I am. Okay. So is it possible that there's people who are mothers and are exhausted like you are, but they're not posting on Instagram about it? Maybe. How would we know? I guess I could ask people. Does that seem doable? Do you have anyone you would ask? No, I don't have anyone I would ask. That's too scary to me. I can't do that. Okay. Well, if we were to kind of dial it down a little bit, what if we just do a quick internet search? What if we Google, I love my kids, but I don't always like them, and just see what comes up? And her eyes are big, and she's like, oh my God, that's so scary. And I'm like, I'll type it if you want me to type it. I'll be the one that says it out loud, and we'll just look and see it. She's like, okay. So we type it in, we search. How many results are there? There's like 6 million results. Because if you're listening, if you're a parent, yeah, it's possible to love someone and not always want to be around them. Those are different things, right? This isn't a romantic comedy movie from the 90s. It's real life. So I say, okay, so there's a lot of results. Should we click on some of these? Should we read some? So we start reading some of the kind of the blog entries of like mommy blogs. And she's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I thought I was the only one. So what do you make of that? I guess I'm not the only one. So these moms that you're reading about, do they seem to hate their kids? No, I mean, they love them. I mean, their kids are exhausting because these kids are like stinkers, but they obviously love their kids. Okay, so is that evidence that maybe you're not the only one who feels this way? Yeah, there's people online. Okay. Now, but then we're trying to expand it, right? The goal is she has this pattern of avoidance. We're trying to push her in the direction of not avoiding. So okay, so these are people online. We don't actually know if they're real. Could we expand this to try and see if other people in your life have feelings as well? I guess so. I mean, that's kind of scary, but I guess so. Well, where might you start? I don't even know. Well, I'm here. Do you want to ask me if I have feelings? Do you want to ask me if I ever feel down? Do you want to ask me if I ever have some of the feelings you have? I guess. I mean, I'm kind of scared too, but I'm also really curious now that you say it. I'll answer honestly. I'll tell you the answer to your question. Okay, but you have to ask me. Okay, Dr. Waltman, do you have like feelings like I do? Yeah, Fiona, I have feelings. I have all the feelings, right? I get sad sometimes, I get angry sometimes, I get envious sometimes, I get embarrassed sometimes. Sometimes I have a lot of feelings. It's part of being alive. Fiona goes like, oh my God, my therapist has feelings, right? And then there's a chance we're trying to kind of expand it, right? So, okay, so if you have feelings, people online have feelings, I have feelings, the people online could be crazy. I could be crazy. Therapists are always kind of crazy. What about like other people in your life? Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious. Maybe I got to find this out. Well, who do you think would be the kind of the easiest person to start with talking with? Maybe my sister. I could ask. I could ask her. We're still talking. I mean, she's been hospitalized a few times for suicide attempts, and I know she has a history of depression. So maybe I could talk with her about it. Of course, I'm going. Wait, this hasn't come up ever before. Oh my gosh, you're telling me your sister obviously has feelings, but okay, good. We're setting you up for hopefully a successful behavioral experiment. So we talk about when she's going to visit her, what she's going to talk about, how's it going to go, what might get in the way, and then she goes and does it and comes back. And as we're talking about it, she's like, I'm like, so how did it go? Did you talk with your sister about your feelings and your depression? She says, you are not going to believe this, which I love. I love. I'm like, okay, well, what happened? She's like, yeah, I told her, my secret about having depression. And then she said, yeah, depression runs in our family. We all have depression. You didn't know that? She says, no, dad told me that no one feels this way and I should try and hide it. She says, Dad's been going to the VA for 3 decades to get treated for PTSD. What are you talking about? My client's like, what? Are you kidding me? This man who told me it wasn't okay to feel this way, that all these things were weaknesses, was getting treatment himself this whole time. That was funny. But it's a nice look at people, their early expectations and the context of those expectations really shape how they form the evidence that they have, and they could really be missing something, right? This evidence was really twisted with her kind of early interpretation, and as she was able to go gather new evidence and helped her see, maybe I'm really not the only one, right? The main person who was telling me this wasn't okay has feelings too. The chance for me to say, well, what do you make of that? Well, I guess my dad has feelings. So how do we fit this together, right? So if your dad had feelings, but your dad told you it's not okay to have feelings, what does that mean? I guess he didn't want me to have feelings. Maybe my feelings brought up his feelings. Do you think this is more of a him issue or more of a you issue? I think it's more of a him issue. I think he just probably was uncomfortable with feelings, and my feelings made him feel bad. And he didn't want to see it. Maybe that makes sense. And this helps us kind of move in the direction of, well, how do you want to expand? How do you want to move forward in your life if some of these early rules aren't exactly true? So, like we were saying before, so many great lines of inquiry can be found from evaluating elements in the previous steps, right? So elements from the previous step was, my dad told me this isn't okay, right? The strategy is to kind of pull this idea of like, well, how do you know that? What's that based on? Can we talk about that, see if there's any context that we're missing? And as we talk about that, if we can kind of help deflate or recontextualize or look at some of that stuff more objectively, oftentimes the case isn't as strong as it felt like, and that can help people go, oh, I feel kind of lighter. That was really heavy. So we're trying to ask ourselves, if it wasn't true that she was the only one that had feelings, what would be going on in her life that we could look to? Well, people in her life would have feelings too. So is there a way we can help her see that? Sometimes we might need to draw on a time orientation. This is useful because sometimes clients come into treatment when things are at their absolute worst, and we need to help them recognize that things might be bad now, but that doesn't mean they're always going to be bad. But we can't just tell them that because they don't believe it, right? So for example, if you have someone on your caseload and her kids were removed by CPS after she was using meth, and she has this idea that she's a terrible mother, there have been moments in her life where, from a legal perspective, she was an unfit mother. There's hard evidence there, but that's not the whole story of her life. So has it always been this way? Does it always have to be this way? Is there a path towards redemption? With that good mother, bad mother continuum, what grade level were you before this? What grade level were you when the kids were taken away? Where are you at now? Where do you want to get to? How do we get you there? So there's a lot of questions that we can ask, so is there any context that we can add? If we were in the situation, what do we think would have happened? Because we have different filters than they do. So we'll see things that they don't see. Are there exceptions? Or what are the facts? What would they tell a friend? What might a friend tell them? Has it always been this way? And then pulling it back to, when you believe this, what do you do? When you do that, what do you get? Are there experiences you don't have because of your avoidance? And that's gonna push for behavioral experiments. That's gonna push for trying new things out. Can we go and gather new evidence? So once we do all of that, then we're on to summary and synthesis. And this is a step that people often skip because usually there is some emotional catharsis that comes with collaborative curiosity. Usually there's a place where the client goes like, oh, I feel better now that we talked about that. And it can be easy to say, oh, they feel better and move on. But really, Socratic questioning is a process of analysis or breaking things down, and then synthesis, pulling things back together. So we need to help them kind of fit it back together in a way that we can then connect that with some kind of action plan, because we want them to make changes in their life. So questions like, how does this all fit together? What do they make of this? What's the new perspective that balances both sides of the story? So currently, a lot of us are in lockdown, but not too long ago, right, as recently as February, we could go places, we could do things. It was lovely. I definitely enjoyed it a lot. Not this February, but the previous February, I was hiking Zion's National Park down in southern Utah with the Red Rock. And there's a very famous hike called Angel's Landing, which is very steep, but it's a very pretty view. And because it's so steep, there's all these switchbacks. And so you're not going that high in elevation, but you're walking back and forth so you don't fall. And it's a little bit of a grueling hike if you're not in great shape, but it's pretty and worth it. And when you get to the top, you don't say, oh, that was cool, all right, high five, and then go back down. But you get there, you sit down, you catch your breath, you look around, you really take in the sight. And that's a similar thing to what we want to do with our Socratic dialogue. Right, we spent all this time trying to figure out what are we focusing on, how does this make sense, what's the new evidence? And then when we get there, we want to spend some time to go, okay, so let's look at the big picture. Let's see how it all fits together. Let's get the panoramic view. And once we have the panoramic view, we can try and figure out, well, what do you see? What's the whole picture? How does this all make sense? So the main idea is just don't move on too fast. Get your money's worth. If you need to come back to this next session, come back to a next session. So last week we talked about this. Let me summarize it for you. Okay, now that we're here again, are you able to see this? What can we make of this? If you're trying to mentally organize all these steps, here's a table. Growing up, I was an athlete. Well, kind of like an athlete. I was a mathlete. It's like athletes, but with math. So I kind of think in these kind of terms, but we have this new balanced believable thought we're trying to come up with. And that's based on a summary and a synthesis of the whole story. The summary and synthesis captures both sides. This captures evidence that supports the initial assumption and evidence that does not support the initial assumption. Evidence that supports the initial assumption is actual evidence, things that really happen, things that are facts. And perceived evidence, these are things that people treat as facts. Some of this is twisted evidence, which is something that is maybe inert or doesn't exactly fit, but someone twists it with their schema to make it fit. Some of it's kind of emotion, some of it's other thoughts. On the other side, there's known evidence. So these are the exceptions. These are reasons they would know before we talk about it, why this might not be true. They might forget it, but they know it. And then there's unknown evidence. So if we can take some of that twisted evidence and untwist it. So for example, if you're working with someone with moral injury from going to war, they might have this idea of, I'm a terrible person. I feel really bad about it, right? I'm a monster. They feel bad about it. But we can see they're using their guilt as evidence that there's something wrong with them. But we can untwist that and say, well, usually guilt is a sign of having a conscience. And usually having a conscience is a sign of not being a monster. They go, oh, I guess I didn't think about that. Yeah. Like I would be more worried about you if you didn't feel bad. Huh. I guess you got a point there. So we can kind of untwist the information. We can find evidence that was ignored, adding new context, like the fact that her dad had feelings too. I had feelings. Trying to highlight this context of, well, you never really talk with anyone about this. You just assume everyone feels this way. Yeah. And then from there, we can go gather new evidence. A lot of questions we can ask. We're trying to summarize it. And then we're seeing, is this believable? Is there a way we can capture both sides? We don't want a purely positive thought because a purely positive thought is fragile. It's not going to last long. So we want to talk with them about what's a way that captures both sides? What's something that's the whole panoramic view? And then in synthesis is we're trying to take that statement and we're trying to line that up with the initial statement, see how do these fit together? How do you reconcile this? Previously, you told me you're the only one who feels this way. And then you asked me, I have feelings. We looked online, they have feelings. Your sister has feelings. Your dad has feelings. What do you make of that? Well, I guess I'm not the only one that has feelings. So what does that mean? I guess it's normal to have feelings. Do you believe that? I do. Okay, so what does that mean? What do you want to do about that? How can you apply that to your week? Well, I guess first thing I could do is I could stop beating myself up for being so down. I would love for you to do that. What are you going to do instead? I'll just maybe have some gentleness with myself. I'll tell myself it's okay to have feelings. Oh my God, please do that. Let me write that down. Let's practice that. So, because if you remember, the belief is maintained because it is in a self-sustaining system. So we need to take the new perspective to a new behavior to change the system to help deflate the belief. So oftentimes compensatory strategies are what's maintaining the belief set, right? So for example, if someone has a belief that they're incompetent, if they have to do something hard, they're going to think, I can't do this, I'm definitely going to fail. If they think I can't do this, I'm definitely going to fail, they're not going to try to do things that are hard, and they're going to quit when they think they're going to fail. I'd rather quit than fail. I'd rather not try than fail. And what happens when you quit and you don't try things is you don't succeed. You don't do a lot. So there's not a lot to show for it. And when there's not a lot to show for it, you say, well, I must be a complete loser. I haven't accomplished anything in my life. But if we're contextualizing it, we can say, well, part of the reason there's not a lot of success in your life is because you're so afraid of trying. So it might be that you're a complete incompetent loser, or it might be you're afraid you're a complete incompetent loser and you haven't ever really tried. The path out of this is trying and failing sometimes and succeeding sometimes. It'll be scary, but you'll get more. Your life will be larger. So this is how we work with core beliefs. This is how we work to bring about systemic change. We look to change the system that they're living in. So we're going to use cognitive reappraisal and Socratic strategies to help bring about new perspectives. And then we're going to push that into, let's test this out. Let's put this into action. Let's do something about that. As we do something about that, something different's going to happen. And as something different happens, we're going to help them focus on, look, you did something different happened. What do you make of that? And over time, we're going to build up a more balanced belief about themselves. Okay. So I think we are out of time. This was enjoyable. Again, the slides are available if you email the ADAA webinars, folks. My email is here as well. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. And thanks for stopping by.
We would like to invite you to register for ADAA's next live webinar on October 8th, Introduction to Affirmative Clinical Practice with Sexual Minority Clients, with Dr. David Pantalone. We also invite you to visit the ADAA website, adaa.org, to view all upcoming live webinars, as well as our full library of on-demand webinars. If you are not yet an ADAA member, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer. ADAA members enjoy year-long access to continuing education webinars such as this, which are CE eligible. CE eligibility is complimentary for ADAA members. Free access to special interest groups, including online peer consultation groups, and much, much more. Please visit adaa.org to become a member and learn more. On behalf of ADAA and our presenter, we thank you for joining us today. Have a wonderful day.